Samuel Beckett was an Irishman who lived most of his life in France. Throughout his life, Beckett, quietly but uncompromisingly, avoided personal publicity. A Nobel Prize winner, he believed writers are never interesting in themselves. For him, the work was all that mattered.
When my father died in 1954, Sam became very, very important for me. He took over my father's role. And of course, when I went to Paris to study the flute, which was at his instigation as well as my flute teachers, then there was the start of a very close relationship indeed. My first contact with his work was when I was at school, and I had a copy of Godot in the library. And I took it out of the library and wrote to Sam to say, I've just taken a copy of Godot out of the school library. And the reply came back quite quickly, I'd wait a few years if I were you. And I think he was quite right, because I didn't make much of it then.
Beckett's first radio play was All That Fall, and he wanted to hear it, and it went out on the third program in 1957, and they said, you can listen to it in Paris, you can hear that. But of course the reception was so bad that he couldn't hear it, so they sent him a tape, and this is how he discovered tape recording. He was very much concerned with the concept of time, and tape recording actually preserves time. In other words, once you have a voice on tape, that voice is alive forever. And so this inspired him to write the play Krapp's Last Tape. Krapp is a man who records a summary of his last year on every birthday.
Mother, at rest at last. The black ball. Black ball?
And of course, Krapp's Last Tape is largely an autobiographical piece. There are many episodes in it which one knows happened to Beckett himself, the death of his mother, and so on.
Box 3, spool 5. Spool. Spool.
The midwife was none other than a Dr. Haddon. It being a public holiday, your father left the house soon after his breakfast with a flask and a package of his favourite egg sandwiches for a tramp in the mountains. There was nothing unusual in this, but on that particular morning his love of walking and wild scenery was not the only mover. When he returned at nightfall, he learned to his dismay from the maid at the back door that labour was still in swing. Though footsore and weary, he was on the point of setting out anew across the fields in the young moonlight, when the maid came running to tell him it was over at last. Over?
Samuel Beckett was born on Good Friday, April the 13th, 1906, in the Dublin suburb of Fox Rock. He was the second son of William and May Beckett.
It was a very elegant house, a lovely big hall, and a lovely drawing room where there's a piano. And we all used to line up in a queue to have a go at the piano. Sam would play, then Frank, and then Molly and I, but we would wait our turn till we could get in and out. I must have gone to the Beckett family as a baby, and Sam was born 15 months later. As we grew a bit older, He couldn't say Sheila, so always called me Ely. And then that went on all the time, he called me Ely. And then as we got older, it turned into Eli, and it stayed like that. All his last letters or contacts with me were Eli, which I loved. Uncle Bill was very warm. He was jolly and fun, but one felt he was a man's man. Aunt May was much more reserved, I thought. But he was a darling, Sam, because he loved animals. I remember on one occasion the gardener came in to say, "Come out, we've caught a rat in the trap." And Sam rushed out and said, "You must let it out. I can't bear it." You see, he was so wonderfully gentle inside and easily hurt.
Winter vest was once like when I was in short trousers. Now the day is over, night is drawing nigh, shadows of the evening steal across the sky. Went to sleep and fell off the pew.
All the Becketts loved sport, and Sam was no exception, winning medals and trophies at rugby, cricket, boxing, golf, and tennis.
He was a great walker, and he and his father were so close. They could walk for miles and miles, and he told me they knew each other so well they didn't have to talk. They just sort of tuned in, which was so lovely with a parent, I think.
Yes, I was my father and I was my son. I asked myself questions and answered as best I could. I had it told to me evening after evening, the same old story I knew by heart and couldn't believe. Or we walked together, hand in hand, silent, sunk in our worlds, each in his worlds, the hands forgotten in each other.
My main connection with Beckett was in the early days, and my main meeting with him arose because of my connection with Carrickmines Golf Club, which I entered as a Trinity member in 1924, about the spring of that year. Now, Beckett was a reasonably good golfer, and I was a reasonably good golfer, so that we were thrown together as people who could play each other and enjoy the games. Oh, we were photographed together. I have a photograph of that.
Beckett family are associated with this club now for years. Sam was a remarkably good golfer. He played off 2-3 handicap, which I suppose would be equivalent to a 5 or 6 handicapper the present day. He had a type of swing, you know. There was nothing extraordinary about it. He looked skillful, which undoubtedly he was, but if I may, he swung the club in being tall, he leaned over quite a bit, you know, and had rather a flat swing. That's what we describe as a flat swing, you know. You're not up here, you're a bit this way at it, you know. But he got results.
Beckett was a brilliant student from Portora, and he was doing modern language, and he was a brilliant modern language student. He was head of his class all the time. I was what I suppose you would call a Midland scholar only. His university studies came to an end and he's got his degree, a brilliant degree he got. I think he got a gold medal in modern languages.
Trinity College sent a lecturer in English to Normal Superior, and Normal Superior sent a lecturer in French to Trinity College. And the next day I was in Normal Superior, I found a note, and that note said, I'm supposed to be your lecturer in English. Shall we meet tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock? And it was signed Samuel Beckett. Dublin, compared to Paris, and particularly that extraordinary life in Montparnasse, and in the cinema, in the theater, and in the concert hall, Dublin was, shall I say, nothing, really, nothing. Practically all the poets, all the writers, and all the painters were there. I mean, one of the first nights I was there was Picasso sitting at a table, and Chagall was sitting at another table, and André Breton and the Surrealists were sitting at another table, and all that, it was just like that.
Beckett was 22 when he left Dublin for Paris. 26 years before, at the age of 20, James Joyce made the same journey. With an introduction from poet and fellow Irishman Thomas McGreevy, Beckett soon met Joyce. He was greatly impressed.
The meeting with Joyce had a huge impact, such an impact that I had the impression that he would never get out of it, finally. Once he was in Joyce, I had the impression that he would never get out. Well, I mean, Joyce, Joyce was a very powerful, he had a powerful grip on the people. When Joyce telephoned to you and said, would you be free this afternoon by any chance, and could you spare me 1 or 2 hours? Well, I mean, you couldn't say no. You couldn't say no. You had to say yes. And you went, naturally, and it was an enchantment. I was indignant about Sam, for quite a few years, because when he brought out Horoscope, for instance, well, this was typically Joycean, Well, I had the impression that he was going to be a Joycean adept.
Day after day, he could be seen slowly pacing the islet. Hour after hour, in his long black coat, no matter what the weather, and old world Latin quarter hat. With never a word exchanged, they grew to be as one.
Beckett returned to Dublin in 1930. At the age of 24, with the support of his friend and mentor, Professor Thomas Rudmose Brown, he was appointed lecturer in French at Trinity College.
Of course, we were all in place when he came in, and he swept in his MA gown, and he did not. It was a very small classroom. There were just about, I think, 3 rows of desks, and his desk was very close to the front row, so he, instead of looking at all his students, he always turned sideways with his back to the window and talked to the far corner of the room, rather than look into the faces of all the students in front of him. When we came up to final exams, Ruddy Brown suggested I should go to see Mr. Samuel Beckett, and he asked me to come to his room in Clare Street, which is at the back of Trinity College, and he had a room in there full of cigarette smoke, a table absolutely covered with books and papers, and black coffee on the desk, and of course a huge tray of cigarette ends. He smoked the whole time, but he was much more relaxed than when he was in lecturing. He could just talk naturally, and I really took everything in that he said.
In January 1932, having taught for just 4 terms, Beckett abruptly resigned his academic post. A 4-line poem was his brief indictment of the scholarly life.
Spend the years of learning squandering courage for the years of wandering through a world politely turning from the loutishness of learning.
Even at that time, he was ploughing his own furrow. He knew exactly what he wanted to do. Well, didn't know exactly what he wanted to do, but knew there was something that had to be done. And he was always he continued like that. But of course, for a young man at that time to be doing that, and that furrow didn't coincide with the one that his parents had mapped out for him. And I know that at one stage his father thought, well, if all else fails, we can get him a job in the brewery. It's Guinness's brewery.
I had gone in as a nautical clerk in a firm of accountants in Dublin. And I told Sam that I had found people in these offices who were not, hadn't the benefit of an education from a university, and they were people whom I found, normal people whom I found most interesting. And he turned to me and he said, I'm not interested in normal, I'm only interested in the abnormal. Now that was the time that I found mentally that he and I were moving apart.
Hard to believe I was ever that young whelp. The voice, Jesus, and the aspirations, and the resolutions. To drink less in particular. Statistics. 1,700 hours out of the preceding 8,000 odd consumed on licensed premises alone, more than 20%, say 40% of his waking life. Plans for a less engrossing sexual life. Last illness of his father, flagging pursuit of happiness, unattainable laxation, sneers at what he calls his youth, and thanks to God it's over. False ring there.
Samuel Beckett's favourite relative was his father's only sister, his Aunt Cissy. She had married a Bohemian art dealer, William Sinclair, known affectionately as Boss Sinclair. They had 4 daughters. Sam was greatly attracted to one of them.
This was a portrait that was painted by one of the people who visited our house, a man called Lyhausen, who painted the picture of my sister, Peggy. She was 17, 18, that sort of age at that time. Well, Peggy and Sam met when Peggy and I came on holiday to Ireland, and she was 17. And Sam they fell in love with each other. And then when we returned to Germany, he came to see us very soon after that.
Und in die Küche, und stahl dem Koch ein Ei. Da nahm der Koch einen Löffel und schlug den Hund zu Brei.
There was a special poem that Sam liked, which I learned in school. He asked me to repeat it, and then he laughed and thought it was such a funny thing. And the second act of Waiting for Godot, Vladimir starts off with the poem. A dog came in the kitchen and stole a crust of bread, then cook up with the ladle and beat him till he was dead. Then all the dogs came running and dug the dog a tomb. And so it goes on. My father was an art dealer, my mother was a painter, and we had many friends who were from the art world and painters, and young painters at that time, in Germany. and it was a regular thing to go to the gallery and entertain painters in the house. And Sam loved all the casualness, I think, and the easygoing life. This is the Landgrafenstrasse where Sam came to visit us first. We lived on the 3rd floor, very small flat with a dark corridor, a kitchen, 2 bedrooms and a sitting room, and there were 5 children and my parents. So it was a bit of a squash, to say the least of it. And my mother cared for us all. Particularly was anxious about Sam because he ate very little, and she used to buy special things for him. And I think here he first felt a great affinity with Germany and the culture here. Peggy and Sam loved each other. And they must have come to this river, and this was boating on the river, and this was in Krapp's last tape. This water, people swimming, people rowing, enjoying the water and the willows.
Up a lake with the punt, bathed off the bank, then pushed out into the stream and drifted. She lay stretched out on the floorboards with her hands under her head and her eyes closed. I said again I thought it was hopeless and no good going on, and she agreed without opening her eyes. I asked her to look at me, and after a few moments she did. But the eyes just slits because of the glare. I bent over her to get them in the shadow, and they opened. Let me in. We drifted in among the flags and stuck. The weather went down, sighing before the stem.
Well, I don't know what happened because I was too young, but I've heard that they wanted to marry, but that it was frowned on by the family because they were first cousins. And I really can't tell you any more than that about it. I wasn't kept informed. I was too young. Very soon she went away to school to learn. It was a music and dancing school in Austria, near Vienna. And she must have been 18 at that time, 19 say, but she contracted tuberculosis. And she died when she was 21 in Germany. And we returned to Ireland at that time, just after that. That was 1933, and Hitler had come into power.
While he could manage it, Beckett travelled about the continent, mostly in Germany. He visited galleries, he studied, he idled, before returning jobless, tail between his legs, to his Dublin home in Foxrock.
Mr. Beckett lived on Brighton Road, Cooldrina. We all knew where Cooldrina was. And of course, when the postman would go there with his post, they had to make sure that Mrs. Beckett's Kerry Blue wasn't out. One of the postmen was singing postman. He was named Mr. John Thompson. And then you had the other man who was Dignam. That's the man with the one eye. Well, then you had in the railway station was Tommy Farrell. He was the station master. And his father before him was station master.
How long have you been master of this station now, Mr. Barrell?
Don't ask me, Mrs. Rooney, don't ask me.
You stepped into your father's shoes, I believe, when he took them off.
Poor Pappy. He didn't live long to enjoy his ease.
I remember him clearly.
Mrs. Beckett came up on a horse, and she was all dressed in black, and she was looking for my sister to go as a parlour maid, but she had already got a job, so she said to me, could I go? Would I like to go? Could I clean out a fire and could I dust and things like that? And I said yes, so she said, well, I'll take you on a month's trial. If I made a mistake, I'd be reprimanded about it, and Mr. Beckett said, leave the girl alone, she's only training. He wouldn't mind, but Mrs. Beckett was very particular. There was Mr. Beckett, Mrs. Beckett and Mr. Beckett, and Mr. Frank and Mr. Sam. And then they had a donkey, and his name was Kish. And Mrs. Beckett had a trap made, and they used to go out for drives in it.
He was at home less than a year when in June 1933 his father died of a heart attack.
I think his father's death really affected him far more than anybody thought. And from then on he was sort of searching for something inside. And I think this perhaps helped him in his writings to express this inner sadness or loss, I'm not sure which. He really seemed an unhappy person after that in France when he was doing his creative work. The whole thing was trying to give birth to this something inside that had disturbed him.
When he chuckled, you tried to chuckle too. When his chuckle died, yours too. That you should try to imitate his chuckle pleased and tickled him greatly, and sometimes he would chuckle for no other reason than to hear you try to chuckle too.
Overwhelmed by his father's death, Beckett wrote to his friend Thomas McGreevy.
All the little things come back. Memoire de l'escalier. I can't write about him. I can only walk the fields and climb the ditches after him.
Beckett left Ireland again, and this time headed for London, where he spent 2 miserable years. Depressed and confused, he put together a collection of poems and began to write his first novel, Murphy.
The sun shone, having no alternative on the nothing new. Murphy sat out of it as though he were free, in a mew in West Brompton.
This is the cockpit in High Park, facing the Serpentine. And Beckett, when he was living in London in the 30s, used to come and walk here very frequently, and he would lie on the grass and think about his novel. And it was the first novel to be published in 1938. Unfortunately, it did not do very well. Most of the copies were destroyed in 1940 in the Blitz.
She had turned out of Edith Grove into Cremorne Road, intending to refresh herself with a smell of the Reach, and then return by Lots Road. When, chancing to glance to her right, she saw, motionless in the mouth of Stadium Street, considering alternately the sky and a sheet of paper, a man. Murphy.
This is Stadium Road. Beckett lived around here in the 30s when he was writing his novel Murphy. And Murphy, the character Murphy, is very like Beckett himself and based on him. It's a very funny novel, but it's also a very black one because Beckett was going through a bad patch. He was not quite sure if he was ever going to make it as a writer and how great his talent really was. But it's one of the few novels where places are very exactly named. Cremorne Road, which is right in front of me, Stadium Road here, Lots Road round the corner, Edith Grove behind me, all places that are named in the novel Murphy, and places where Murphy wandered around London, as Beckett himself did, usually in a very depressed state. I think that he certainly went through a period where he was very worried about his own talent, very worried about his own sanity. But the family were perfectly normal. They just couldn't understand how they produced, this queer character who simply wanted to go away and write in a way that nobody could seem to be able to read, I mean, he was certainly not taken up in any way by the Dublin literary establishment. They couldn't understand him either. He certainly wanted an audience. I remember once we were having a rather black conversation about the state of the world, and he said, it would be better if the whole muck heap just blew up and ended all. And I said, but then there'd be nobody left to read you. And there was a long pause. He didn't like it very much.
17 copies sold, of which 11 at trade price to free circulating libraries beyond the seas. Getting known. £1, 6 and something. 8, I have little doubt.
Sam's mother would have found it, I think, impossible to understand. It was just something that wasn't in her comprehension. This sort of life, writing, what's that? She's not writing for anybody. It was something I'm sure that she would have found almost impossible to understand.
I came down here with Frank yesterday evening. It is a great relief to me to get away from home, where the position between Mother and me has become impossible. I was wrong in thinking I was well enough to deal with her, and with myself in relation to her. Now I'll give it up une fois pour toutes.
I don't think he meant to disagree with his mother too much, but sometimes he really couldn't accept some of the things he was expected to do. Sam sometimes wasn't easy, and their relationship was a bit strained, but really, deep down, there was a deep love on both sides, especially when they were far apart. He used to do lovely things, send her roses from Paris, if it was a birthday or something special. He always remembered her, and their relationship, I'm sure, was great love and respect, but she did get a little disturbed if he wasn't doing what she wanted him to do.
She was very worried about him when he was away and that, and we used to write to him, and we used to send him a few pounds now and then, rolled up in the newspaper on the quiet, just in case he needed it. But Mr. Sam used to only come home now and then, and he'd be off away in France or London or somewhere. But when he'd be there, he loved the piano. He played the piano a lot. And he'd be there and he'd be writing. And Mrs. Beckett said she couldn't make head or tail of the writing. But however, he used to write an awful lot. But he was real casual, there wasn't a bit of bother, and he was very friendly, and sometimes he'd go away and he'd say, I won't come back till I'm an old man with a beard.
I'll be here till I die, creeping along genteel roads on a stranger's bike.
In 1937, I was a member of the academic staff here. I was assistant in geology, and I was a member of the Common Room Club. And there had just started in the courts this libel action case where Oliver St. John Gogarty had written his biography as I was walking down Sackville Street. And this pair of brothers, the Sinclairs, pounced on this verse in the text and alleged that they could be personally identified in it and that they had been libeled by it because they were described rather coarsely in it. Whereas Sam Beckett, who was a relative of the Sinclairs, was called to support their case and claimed that he had recognized them in the poem. But unfortunately, Gogarty had retained John Mary Fitzgerald, who was one of the leading people at the Irish bar and a brilliant orator and cross-questioner, and he had himself taken a first-class honours degree in French in this college, and he knew all about French literature and French authors and how to pronounce their names. Anyway, he took Beckett very quickly through the bit about recognising it, and then he hoisted himself for the kill.
How long did it take before your book was banned by the Censorship Board of Ireland?
About 6 months.
I suggest it was banned because it was a blasphemous and obscene book.
I never discovered why it was banned.
Do you call yourself a Christian, Jew, or atheist?
None of the three.
He turned to Beckett and he said, "Oh, you've been in Paris," with some emphasis on Paris for some years, Mr. Beckett. Yes. And you've written a number of books. Yes. And you've also written about some French writer called Proust, I think. So poor Sam rose to the bait and said, in a rather supercilious tone, "Are you referring to the distinguished French author Proust?" And Beckett, Fitzgerald didn't say another word. He just looked at the jury and his glance that said more than any words, "How can we honest Dubliners be expected to know how to pronounce the names of these dirty foreign writers?" and sat down. It was devastating. This was done deliberately with the purpose of destroying Beckett as a reliable witness, and unfortunately carried the consequence that I think it so disgusted Beckett with Dublin that he immediately returned to Paris, and his later Dublin visits, I think, were only very short and only when they couldn't be avoided.
Let me say, before I go any further, that I forgive nobody. I wish them all an atrocious life, and then the fires and ice of hell, and in the execrable generations to come, an honoured name.
On the 11th of January, the Irish Times carried a report on the stabbing of an Irish writer in Paris. Beckett had been knifed in the street the previous day and was recovering in hospital.
Dear Tom, I shall be all right as far as I can see. The pleura were wounded, but apparently not the lung. First I was in a ward, then Joyce had me moved into a private room. Everyone has been incredibly kind. Mother, Frank, and Jean came.
A woman of his acquaintance read of the same incident in a French newspaper and immediately went to visit him. She was Suzanne Deschevaux de Menil, a pianist and music teacher, originally from the small town of Troyes and now living in Paris. It was the beginning of a lifelong relationship. Music was their great interest, though Suzanne did on one occasion try her hand at literature and published a tiny fragment of her own in Transition. Beckett translated and wrote a note about the contributor.
Suzanne Dumnil, forgotten in musical, unknown in literary circles.
After the stabbing incident, Beckett found a new apartment at 6 Rue de Favorite in the 15th arrondissement.
Here with my new address. People have been good with presents to get me started, but it is a terribly expensive business. I like the place. It is bright and comfortable, and I like the quartier, well away from the stage artists.
Suzanne, qui avait besoin de jouer du piano, ne pouvait guère le faire chez elle.
Suzanne loved to play the piano, but she couldn't always do so at her apartment in Rue des Favorites or later at Boulevard Saint-Jacques, because a piano is disturbing for neighbours and for one's companion, so I invited her to come here on Fridays while I was away. She gladly accepted my invitation. It was like a second home for her on Fridays. She could play the piano here at her ease. She did not wish to disturb anybody, and she was also anxious that nobody should listen to her playing.
I was 33 this week, and wonder if the second half of the bottle will be any better than the first half. If there is a war, as I fear there must be soon, I shall place myself at the disposition of this country.
He was in Dublin when the war broke out, and he went rushing back to France to be with his French friends, and got involved in the resistance. And he saw, of course, all the things that happen in warfare, the terrible things that happen to an oppressed population.
Sam, being Irish, was neutral, so could be in Paris without fear of imprisonment. But he couldn't stand by and see what was happening to his friends. So he got involved with the resistance. And eventually, of course, one of his group were captured and talked. And, of course, the Gestapo came looking for him. A friend of Suzanne's, Roger Delertre, had a sister who lived in Roussillon. And Roussillon, of course, was in the so-called the free part of France. Although the Germans were there, they were patrolling it. So even if they went there, they went in position of total safety. But they got down there some way, with great difficulty, and spent the war down in Roussillon.
Quelle sorte de travail en général ce qu'il a fait? Vous pouvez raconter un peu, oui.
Chez nous, les raisins, ramasse les raisins.
He picked the grapes and the cherries.
Les gerbes.
He gathered the wheat.
On n'avait pas les moissonneuses.
At that time, we didn't have modern machinery.
On foulait. Vous savez,
He worked the land,
on foulait le
planted the
solaire,
wheat,
on
and
utilisait
dug
les
the
gerbes,
fields.
Et puis les chevaux tournaient.
He worked for my father and the Bonelli family.
Oui, il y avait quand même un élément de danger ici, parce que c'était un Irlandais qui voulait se cacher.
Voilà, je crois qu'il y avait du danger.
Oh yes, I think there was danger from the moment he hid himself. During the war, everybody lived in fear. Everybody here was in danger.
C'est ça. Et en général, les gens d'ici, ils croyaient qu'il était un travailleur.
You know, it was only at the last minute he explained to us that he was a writer. But he didn't show us his work. He didn't talk to us about his business. He was right. He had kept his secret.
He wrote What during the war, and the genesis of Godot in particular came from there. I mean, we know that Godot is set in the Vaucluse, where he was, and it is exactly about man's inhumanity to man, about trying to survive in difficult times when anybody you meet is likely to be a bully. I mean, Pozzo, in a way, represents the Germans, I think.
But down there, everything is red. I didn't notice anything, I tell you.
You're a hard man to get on with, Gogo.
It'd be better if we parted. You always say that. And you always come crawling back. The best thing would be to kill me. Like the other. What other? What other? Like billions of others.
Terrible period, terrible. Not only strange, but I mean real breakups too, you know. Terrible, terrible. I mean, France never recovered from that, you know. I was not on the other side. I mean, I was on my side, if I may say so. I know that some people from the Resistance came to see me, and you know, I belonged to the Vichy government for 9 months, and I was kicked out by Pierre Laval, and kicked out. I prefer not saying what way, because it was very dangerous. I could have been taken by the Germans and sent to a camp, you know, and I wouldn't be there at present, very probably. He disappeared during the occupation, and he was on his side, and I was on mine, and I didn't know where he was. I remember I asked questions, and nobody answered. Nobody knew where he was. And as he was in the Resistance, of course, people wouldn't say, naturally.
Beckett refused to discuss his work for the resistance. He dismissed his wartime activities as Boy Scout stuff. Whatever his actions, they were evidently successful, for after the war, General de Gaulle conferred on Samuel Beckett the Croix de Guerre.
After the Second World War, Sam called and said he was in London, and could he come now and see us, which he did. He was looking really very ill, very emaciated. His teeth were bad, everything was bad, and he was going home to Ireland to see his mother.
He was distressed to find she had aged, suffering from Parkinson's disease. He stayed in Ireland for 6 weeks caring for his mother, and during this time experienced what he would later, with some embarrassment, identify as a revelation.
Spiritually, a year of profound gloom and indigence, until that memorable night in March at the end of the jetty in the howling wind, never to be forgotten, when suddenly I saw the whole thing, the vision at last. This, I fancy, is what I have chiefly to record this evening, against the day when my work will be done, and perhaps no place left in my memory, warm or cold, for the miracle that... for the fire that set it alight. What I suddenly saw then was this, that the belief I had been going on all my life, namely... Great granite rocks, the foam flying up in the light of the lighthouse, and the wind gauge spinning like a propeller, clear to me at last that the dark I have always struggled to keep under is in reality my most... unshatterable association, until my dissolution of storm and night with the light of the understanding and the fire.
All the jetty and howling wind are imaginary. It happened to me summer 1945 in my mother's little house named New Place, across the road from Cooldraina.
Beckett saw he was on the wrong lines. He said, to hell with enrichment, let's get impoverished. To write and explore his true self, he did something astonishing. He changed languages. The new language Beckett chose was an old one, French. The task he set himself was not easy, but the challenge enabled him to escape from inherited literary traditions.
My other writings are no sooner dry than they revolt me, but my epitaph still meets with my approval. There is little chance, unfortunately, of its ever being reared above the skull that conceived it, unless the state takes up the matter. But to be unearthed, I must first be found, and I greatly fear those gentlemen will have as much trouble finding me dead as alive. So I hasten to record it here and now while there is yet time. Hereunder lies the above, who up below so hourly died that he lived on till now.
Beckett spent a long period during the war in the Roussillon. When he had finally succeeded getting back to Ireland, he wanted to get back to Paris, but you couldn't travel. The war was still on. The Allied armies were going towards Germany. And so in order to get back to France, he joined the Irish Red Cross and worked as an orderly in the Irish hospital at Saint-Lô in Normandy, which was the one place in Normandy which had been totally wiped out, because that was the place where they first landed. And the landscape of desolation and total ruin recurs ever after in his work.
I think that to the end of its hospital days, it will be called the Irish Hospital. I mention this possibility in the hope that it will give general satisfaction. And having done so, I may perhaps venture to mention another, more remote, but perhaps of greater import in certain quarters. I mean the possibility that some of those who were in Saint-Lô will come home realizing that they got at least as good as they gave, that they got indeed what they could hardly give, a vision and sense of a time-honored conception of humanity in ruins, and perhaps even an inkling of the terms in which our condition is to be thought again. These will have been in France.
When it was safe to do so, Sam and Suzanne returned to Paris, returned to the flat in the Rue des Favorites, which they found intact, all their stuff still there. But life couldn't be the same as it was before the war. A lot of their friends had gone. Of course, Joyce was gone. Sam's great friend, Alfred Perron, had been captured and died, not in captivity, but died just after he was released. Life, indeed, was in Paris, post-war Paris, was a lot different.
The news of France is very depressing. Depresses me, anyhow. All the wrong things, all the wrong way. It is hard sometimes to feel the France that one clung to, that I still cling to. I don't mean material conditions which are appalling. It is quite impossible for me to live now with my pittance. I had hoped my books would make up the difference, but there is little chance of their pleasing here more than elsewhere. Suzanne earns a little money with her dressmaking. That is what we're living on at present.
39 today, sound as a bell, apart from my old weakness, and intellectually, I have now every reason to suspect it the crest of the wave, or thereabouts. Celebrated the awful occasion as in recent years, quietly at the wine house. Not a soul. Sat before the fire with closed eyes, separating the grain from the husks. I jotted down a few notes on the back of an envelope. Good to be back in my den, in my old rags.
He started writing furiously, and this really set off his creativity. Whereas previously, it had been said by various people that he's very talented, but he'll never do anything because he's too idle, he never does anything. He was very lethargic. Rather, I think because of psychological problems, he again felt it wasn't worth doing anything. And this suddenly set him off, and he started writing. Between 46 and 49, he had this tremendous outburst, so much so that his wife was very worried because he was writing day and night, and she thought he'd collapse.
All this business of a labour to accomplish, before I can end, of words to say, a truth to recover, in order to say it before I can end, of an imposed task once known, long neglected, finally forgotten, to perform before I can be done with speaking, done with listening. I invented it all in the hope it would console me, help me to go on, allow me to think of myself as somewhere on a road, moving between a beginning and an end, gaining ground, losing ground, getting lost, but somehow in the long run making headway. All lies. I have nothing to do, that is to say, nothing in particular. I have to speak, whatever that means.
I'm tired, from overwriting, probably. A book of short stories, 2 novels, and a play in under 2 years. They go out into the usual void, and I hear little more about them.
In the summer of 1950, Beckett returned to Dublin to be with his mother, who was dying of Parkinson's disease. She was moved from Fox Rock to the Merrion nursing home overlooking the Grand Canal. Beckett stayed with her throughout her final illness.
I was there when... the blind went down. One of those dirty brown roller affairs, throwing a ball for a little white dog, as chance would have it. I happened to look up, and there it was, all over and done with at last. I sat on for a few moments with the ball in my hand and the dog yelping and pawing at me. Moments. Her moments. My moments. The dog's moments.
Suzanne took it upon herself. He got fed up with it. He wasn't interested. He had given up hope, I think. But she took it upon herself to take the manuscripts round from one publisher to the other, get one rejection slip after another. And eventually heard about a young publisher called Jerome Lindon, went to see him, and he said, fine, bring the manuscripts, and I'll read them.
Beckett waited across the street in the Café Cluny. He was insisting that Malloy, Malone Dies, and The Unnameable be published as a trilogy or not at all. The news was good. Enchanted by what he described as the overwhelming beauty of the text, Lindon agreed a contract. With each book of the trilogy, Beckett descended to a lower level. He felt he was on a road going nowhere. He looked, he said, for a habitable place. He found it on the stage. Beckett found in the theatre a way of making public his private world of humor and compassion.
This is the location where I was, the Théâtre de Babylone, 40 years ago. This is the place where all Paris was coming to see, waiting for Godot by an unknown author who was Samuel Beckett. The theater himself was just behind the trees, and the stage door was at the far end, and it was 4 actors and a young boy entering every night to play Godot.
To us, the background was Roger Blin, because he was the one who had the play and who had shown it to different theatres for almost 2 years, I think. And nobody would really have the courage to do it, or the comprehension. They didn't understand, probably. And when Jean-Marie Serrault, who was the director of our theatres, got the script, he just showed it to me to be sure that I agreed, and it was the most astonishing experience I can think of.
When I received my first line, I was lucky, lucky in the true meaning of the word, because the part was named Lucky, and I was so lucky to play that part. I met Sam for the very first time in my life by a bright and sunny afternoon in autumn in '52. He was in the auditorium, and I came. He gave me the text, I read it, and I was wondering what to do. I obtained no explanations, and the other actors were working the same. But we were smelling that we were in front of a very important chef-d'oeuvre.
I suppose the actors were the important thing, and Roger Blin had a very definite and sure sense of choosing them. And maybe his great idea was to take 2 actors of the, what we called at that time, a cabaret.
In that time, a doctor, friend of mine, Marthe Gauthier, showed me some people who was what we called Parkinsonians. And it's an awful illness, and you are trembling all the time at the end of that illness. And it saved my part, because suddenly when I had to talk, I was wearing one trunk in my left hand and a basket in my right hand. I was standing on my left leg, trembling from the foot to the shoulder, like that. And I have to try once again to play lucky if I can.
Étant donné l'existence telle qu'elle jaillit des récents travaux publics de Poinçon et Wattman, d'un dieu personnel, quoi, à barbe blanche, mais on a le temps, on reverra ça.
From Paris, Waiting for Godot would soon make its way across the world, establishing Samuel Beckett as the most original and influential dramatist of the century. The first English edition, translated by Beckett, was published in New York by Barney Rossett and Grove Press.
Like George Bernard Shaw, Sean Casey, and James Joyce before him. Because of Waiting for Godot and other of his works, Samuel Beckett has won for himself a reputation as one of the great writers of our time. There have been almost as many interpretations of Godot as there have been members of the audience. Samuel Beckett himself calls his play a tragic comedy and leaves it at that.
Waiting for Godot was as well known as a sports term as it was known in the theater world. And I think that's a very important thing. The sports writers picked up on Beckett, I think, faster than the literary people. They understood that, waiting for the great event to happen, which never quite happens. So he had become, I'd say, in a very few years, but after all, when Beckett was no longer young, he was already, I believe, in his 50s, he burst into the sensitivities and the knowledge and the world of all of America.
Success and failure on the public level never mattered much to me. In fact, I feel much more at home with the latter, having breathed deep of its vivifying air all my writing life up to the last couple of years.
He was less poor after the war, when became the great success of Godot. And he was very generous with his friends. And he was helping a lot of poor men and families, and he bought a house in Seine-et-Marne, and he bought his new flat in Boulevard Saint-Jacques. And life was more easy to him.
We have found and taken a room in a farmhouse at Ussy-sur-Marne. Marvelous country. Peace. It is a relief to have a refuge when the strain of noise, neighbours, visits, and art cackle become unbearable.
Sam and Suzanne had walked that area. They'd taken the train out to Ussy. They'd stayed in Ussy in a house owned by a farmer. They'd walked the countryside. They knew it, and they chose the spot on top of a hill with a wonderful view over the valley. They bought the land from the commune, and my father, who was an architect, a quantity surveyor, designed the house. My mother took a photograph at that time of my father, Frank, Sam and Suzanne standing in the garden, my father with his arms around Sam and Suzanne. They all look very happy. They look as if Frank and Sam had been doing a hard day's work in the garden, because Sam was very fond of that garden. This house was vital to him for his work, somewhere he could go to work. At the beginning, Suzanne used to accompany him. At a certain point, Suzanne stopped going down to the house, not because she didn't like it. People said, oh, she didn't like it down there. But it wasn't because of that. It was because she knew that Sam needed solitude.
Fortunately, my father died when I was a boy. Otherwise, I might have been a professor. He had set his heart on it. A very fair scholar I was, too. No thought, but a great memory. One day I told him about Milton's cosmology. Way up in the mountains we were, resting against a huge rock, looking out to sea. That impressed him greatly. Love, too, often in my thoughts when a boy, but not a great deal compared to other boys. It kept me awake, I found. Never loved anyone, I think. I'd remember. In a way, perhaps it's a pity. A good woman might have been the making of me. I might be sprawling in the sun now, sucking my pipe and patting the bottoms of the third and fourth generation, looked up to and respected, wondering what there was for dinner instead of stravaiging the same old roads in all weathers. I was never much of a one for new ground. No, I regret nothing. All I regret is having been born. Dying is such a long, tiresome business, I always found.
For a long, long time, I only saw the one side of him. A kindly, generous, wonderful uncle to my brother and myself. And it wasn't really, I suppose, till I was into my 20s that I saw the other side, his work side. I'd like to show you a very special place in our garden. This pond was built at a rather poignant time when my father was dying of cancer, and my uncle had come over from Paris to stay with us and be a great support to my mother. It's very fitting that you should have come to this garden today, because this is the first day the lilies have flowered in this new season. This photograph would have been taken in the early summer of 1954. My father died in September, so it was really in the last months of his illness when he knew that, we all knew that he wasn't going to live. And I think my mother and Sam must have hatched a plot between them. They wanted to provide a distraction for my father when he was so ill. And between them, they created this lovely pond. My father was an engineer, so he had the wherewithal to get that side of it going. My mother was an artistic person, so she did the artistic direction. And Sam, probably the most important part of all, he was the labourer.
Beckett's first post-war work in English was All That Fall, a radio play broadcast in 1957. It was the beginning of a long and creative relationship with the BBC.
Well, this is Studio B5. In this studio and others like it, here in the basement of Broadcasting House, we did a lot of recordings at which Samuel Beckett very often unexpectedly appeared. It was here in these studios that the famous Beckett voice and the Beckett actor was being evolved. Here we did all these readings of his poetry and of his prose pieces, and all the Beckett actors that he adored so much came here and sat here. Patrick McGee, Jack McGowan, Billy Whitelaw, Ronald Pickup, Nicol Williamson, all these enormously dedicated actors who love to do these texts that seem to be difficult if one read them, but in their mouths, in their voices, they suddenly came to wonderful life. And of course, he himself would watch the proceedings from the cubicle and then come in and work with the actors.
The distinctive voice of the Irish actor Patrick McGee intrigued Beckett. This cracked voice, as he described it, was the inspiration for a new stage drama with the working title McGee Monologue. The one-act play was finally named Krapp's Last Tape.
Lie propped up in the dark and wander. Be again in the dingle on the Christmas Eve, gathering holly, the red-berried. Be again on Croghan on a Sunday morning in the haze with the bitch. Stop and listen to the bells. And so on. Be again. Be Again. All that old misery once wasn't enough for you?
The impact I received of his work was as great as the one I received from Lao Tse when I was 16. That means, you see, it's not a literary experience. It's an experience of profundity, of vision, of wisdom. Then I knew that this man is somebody who would appear on earth once, a person like that, once in 500 years. And then I met him. And when I met him, I couldn't believe it. And he was really somebody like that. I mean, so you would compare him to Petrarca or Dante or Goethe or these people. And it's once in a few centuries, somebody like that appears. A crystal, a spiritual crystal. That means that where ethics and aesthetics fuse.
Sam and Suzanne left Rue des Favorites in 1960 and moved to a new apartment block on Boulevard Saint-Jacques.
The flat is on the 7th floor of a 1960s building. This building was only planned at that time. So he met with the builder and the architect and specified exactly what he wanted. That's where he did his work, he did his correspondence. He spent a lot of his lifetime in that room. A typewriter, telephone, very simple lamp, uncluttered desk, a very large wastepaper basket, necessary part. There are the reference books, his dictionaries, a big array of dictionaries, a copy of Johnson's dictionary, which he used, I know, and copies of the Bible in many languages. Apart from that, there were copies of his own books that he needed for reference and also to give to people. A lot of Joyce's books, a large amount of books on Samuel Johnson, books by Johnson, and books about Johnson. The one, of course, thing that strikes people when they look from the window of that studio is the prison, the Prison de la Santé, which is directly opposite the flat. And, of course, people say that that is typical. He must have chosen it for the prison, but I don't believe it for one moment.
He lived with Suzanne for many years before they got married, and that was in the 60s. And one day he rang me up and asked if I could very discreetly arrange a little ceremony, which I did in Folkestone, and nobody knew anything about it. And he just came over quietly, and they spent a few days driving down the coast looking at Devon and Cornwall. I think he wanted Suzanne, if anything happened to him, to get the benefit of his royalties and his and his work, to give her some kind of position.
Suzanne, in a funny way, was rather a little bit like my grandmother, Sam's mother, because she was a little bit unapproachable until you got to know her. But again, underneath, she was lovely, and I got very fond of her. I used to correspond with her quite a lot when I came home from that particular time. And I can remember making her things, and she was very keen that I would improve my French. So I used to write to her in French. I don't think she was a person one could ever get very close to, but I think I got as close as I dared.
Si je vous ai parlé déjà de la façon dont Suzanne voulait être incognito.
Suzanne wished to remain incognito in all she did concerning Sam's work, because she never forgot the time when she went around with a manuscript of Waiting for Godot and was turned down again and again. With the words, "Rejected manuscript," it was handed back to her.
Le manuscrit d'En attendant Godot, tout cela, elle ne l'a pas oublié. Et quand la pièce a eu le succès qu'elle a eu ultérieurement,
When the play met with success, the very same people now rushed to talk to her in adulation. She couldn't stand it.
Et pour l'aduler. Et ça, elle ne l'acceptait pas. Donc, le rôle de Suzanne était aussi...
Suzanne also had her part to play. Everyone understood that though Sam never attended his productions, in France or abroad, that Suzanne was there as his ambassador.
One day I was doing something quite difficult, and there was not a great audience, and I was surprised to see her after the show. I said, "Oh, you were there?" And she said, "Oh, yes. I'm always there in lost causes."
They were hardly leaving the bus together, but they were hardly leaving without the other one, you know. And when I was with Suzanne, Suzanne asked to me, "Don't drink too much with Sam." And when I was with Sam, he told me, "We take care of Suzanne because she's like a child." You know?
Beckett made his only visit to America in 1964. He crossed the Atlantic to supervise Film, a cinematic work starring Buster Keaton.
Well, when Sam came to New York, this was the neighborhood which he first saw, and perhaps the only one, as far as I know. This neighborhood, which is now known as Soho, then had no name. I had asked Sam to write a motion picture, which he did, and called Film. We had thought to use Patrick McGee in the main part, or Sam had, but something happened, he couldn't make it. And later we tried to get Charlie Chaplin, and he was not available. And then Sam said Buster Keaton. So if Sam said Buster Keaton, we went out to find Buster Keaton, and find him we did. And he came here, and he was in the film. My relationship to Keaton was exactly zero. What Sam's was, I really don't know, because Keaton did not communicate. I never heard the man say a word. But Sam somehow worked with him, and it went off in various problems, but we did the film. Sam was such a gentleman that I never was quite clear as to what he really felt, but I think that he thought of it as a different kind of an experience, and one that need not necessarily be repeated.
Past midnight, never knew such silence. The earth might be uninhabited. Here I end this reel. Box 3, spool 5. Perhaps my best years are gone, when there was a chance of happiness. But I wouldn't want them back. Not with the fire in me now. No, I wouldn't want them back.
In December 1969, the Swedish Academy announced Samuel Beckett the winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature. Jerome Lindon, his French publisher, accepted the award on his behalf. Beckett, together with his wife, avoided the glare of publicity by travelling to North Africa.
I knew him in Tanger. I met him in Tanger. One day in the street, I was with my Leica, and as I saw a wonderful bird, un héron. It was him. I tried to follow him, not because he was Beckett, I did not know yet, toujours he was Beckett. And I took photograph of this wonderful statue. And one day at Gagarin, I said, "You are Beckett?" He said, "Yes." And we walked on the beach during hours. And when we were on this beach of Tanger, he said to me something very strange about his mother. He said, if she could see that I got the Nobel Prize.
He never took it really as a success. He believed that that's a misunderstanding. He said it also many times. He said, there's a misunderstanding. That these things shouldn't have success. So he took it with a grain of salt, you see.
I have heard him called a saint, but I don't think he was at all, and I think he would have hated to be called one. He was a wonderful man, a great human being, but luckily for us, he wasn't a saint. He was such fun and full of mischief and humour and joys of living. I mean, he loved drinking and wandering around Paris. We really had a night out with Sam, and we all went and had dinner in the Coupole, and we went to UNESCO's play when UNESCO came too. But Sam never watched plays very much, so he went out for a walk and came back. And then UNESCO went home, and we all went on. I had my second daughter with us. And we went steadily around all the bars, and as each one shut, we went to another one. And we were getting very, very pissed, to be honest. So was Sam. But there was this wonderful conversation going on between Sam and George. Sam was debating whether it was possible to write a play with no action, with just words and some visual image, but no action at all. And we arrived at the Falstaff, and it was all shut up with iron railings and things. And to our amazement, Sam knocked on the door, and everything opened, and this pub was completely filled with people at 6 o'clock in the morning. And so we started another session there, and I think we lasted till about 7 or 7:30, and then we went home, but we left him there because we just couldn't keep awake anymore. And the result of this conversation, sometime later, was Not I, this play with just the mouth talking, and which Billy Whitelaw did at the Royal Court.
When I used to walk into this theatre through the stage door to start rehearsing Not I would see Sam standing in the corner. I'd walk in from the stage door that way, Sam would be there, and we wouldn't say, "Good morning, Billy, good morning, Sam, how are you?" None of that. We'd launch straight in without a word of out into this world, a tiny little thing before its time, God-forsaken hole, called. No matter, parents unknown, unheard of, he having vanished, thin air, no sooner button up his breeches, she similarly 8 months later, almost at the tick, so no love spared that.
I think everybody had their own reactions to him, but the general feeling of wanting to create what he wanted. Well, it's very rare, really, in the theatre that you get a whole theatre together feeling like that about someone.
There was a total commitment. For me, it was like working with not only a writer and a director, but like working with a painter and a sculptor and a musician and a conductor. In fact, practically every photograph you see of Sam and me is we're conducting each other. I would walk over hot coals for that man.
As rewarding in his personal life as he was in his professional one. But he was very witty, very charming, very knowledgeable. Great fun to be with. We used to laugh a lot. We very rarely spoke about great philosophical matters or anything of import. We would wander around having drinks together in a drinking club in Kensington or drinking Jameson in his hotel in Hyde Park. Wander around all over the place, just generally having fun like a couple of big kids.
We were rehearsing Happy Days, and Leonard Fenton was crawling up the mound towards Billy Whitelaw, who's buried up to the waist in the mound. And he wasn't, from Sam's point of view, wasn't doing it right, wasn't doing it how Sam wanted it done. And Sam was finding it, I think, very, very difficult to explain to Leonard exactly what he wanted at what specific time. It was so precise where he wanted him to go down, where he wanted him to come up, that I think it was frustration after about an hour of trying to do this. Everybody broke for lunch. Everybody disappeared, and I was left here. There was a few levels I wanted to play with on the actual lighting stage, so I went to the lighting box, looked out the window, and there's Sam crawling up the mound. And I happened to have my camera up there, so I stole a few of his private moments, I suppose. But it's quite amazing to watch him for half an hour crawling about on stage. And then he topped that off. When he got back, I think he'd actually worked it out for himself what he wanted, then rehearsed Leonard in about 10 minutes, and it was fine. And Sam crawled round the back of the man, popped the top hat on, and appeared over the top.
When we were rehearsing on this stage, the play ends with Winnie singing to a little box, a little musical box, the Merry Widow Waltz. And he said, Billy, I will just sing this to you so you know the tune. And I said, well, I know it. He said, no, I'll sing it to you. And this is what came out of his mouth. Well, had I not known it was the Merry Widow, I would have not known what he was singing. But I found it so moving and so marvellous that I took it without telling him. He didn't realise I'd stolen it from him. And at the end of the play, the lights go down, or the start, and Winnie just sings this, and this is what I did. Every touch of finger tells me what I know, says to me it's true, you love me so.
All my drawings of Sam were done not to order, I would say. I wouldn't say, come sit for me. He would sit in this chair, listen to music, so I would draw him, or another chair, or here. I mean, all this was, or standing, or he would feel. That means he would feel that else I wouldn't move. His face was extraordinary. It was like a labored, like a field, a plowed field, you know, with all these lines. It's incredible. He had a very beautiful face. And the thing with him is that his interiority, his inner light was in his face. He always used to say, well, we usually spoke French. With Anne used to speak English, but then we spoke also both. And in the past, our friendship began in French. He always used to say, le monde est plein de détresse. Distress is everywhere, you see. He was very upset by it.
He was a man who loved sports, who followed sports, anyone who spoke to him a long time. He loved rugby and golf, and he followed games passionately on television. Sometimes he wouldn't even come over because there was a game on that he wanted to see. And he loved walking, he is the Luxembourg especially, and he loved shuffling through the leaves, and he said it always reminded him that he did the same thing when he was a boy. He spoke fondly of his childhood. He had a happy childhood. Music was, it either began the evening or it ended the evening, but it was the key of the evening. Besides poetry, we used to read a lot of poetry together. But music was the key. And it was Schubert for many years, but at the very end it ended up to just three or four Lieder.
Ich träumt in seinem Schatten so manchen süßen Traum.
Memories stayed with him until the very end. When we went to see him in Paris, my daughter and myself, he was talking about the Wicklow Mountains. And I feel as if he had taken a snapshot in his mind, which just stayed with him forevermore.
Nowhere in particular on the way from A to Z. That dear old back road. Somewhere on the Ballyogan road on the way from A to Z. Head sunk, totting up the tally on the verge of the ditch. Foothills to left. Croker's acres ahead. Father's shade to right and a little to the rear. Out since break of day and night now falling. Reckoning ended, on together from naught anew.
Almost every last work that he wrote from about 1970 onward had the feeling of being a final work. You know, you always felt everything was rounded off. Then somehow he managed to write a little more, to go a little bit further. He said to me once that all he ever tried to do was put his head against the rock cliff and push it another millimeter away. And all his life was just pushing a little bit more the limits of the possibilities of creation, getting a little bit more out of literature, saying a little bit more about the human condition.
All of old. Nothing else ever tried, ever failed. No matter. Try again. Fail again. Fail better.
Sam described to me the difficulty that he was having with his work, and he described it to me as the lines of a V converging, and that he was being cornered. He couldn't get through these converging lines.
Folly for to need to seem to glimpse a faint afar away over there what? What is the word? What is the word?
The thing that people noticed was his gradual lack of mobility, and of course it's something that affected him greatly because He was a great walker, loved getting around, and once he felt that he couldn't do that, and that really depressed him. Already he couldn't go down to UC anymore. He couldn't stay there on his own. That was a great sadness for him. Gradually, he found walking difficult, had to take a stick, couldn't go far, and that was a tremendous loss to him. I think of all the things, that was the one that really struck him the most. Oh, he said to me one time, we were talking about something, he said, Edward, old age, it's not much fun, And he didn't find it much fun. And of course, after Suzanne's death, that was no fun at all. Suzanne was the first to go in the summer of '89. And Sam died within 6 months of Suzanne.
Samuel Beckett died in Paris on December the 22nd, 1989. He was 83. He is buried beside his wife Suzanne in Montparnasse Cemetery. The private ceremony was attended by a score of close friends. There was no religious service and no speeches.
Perhaps thus the end. Then all is before again. So again and again. And patience till the one true end to time and grief and self and second self his own.